This is our concluding session. This is the most probably difficult in terms of what we are going to discuss, and I'm planning to unleash the force and to discuss as many as possible topics as we could. This is about media, but media, first of all, about journalists and journalism, because we have discussed during the conference social media, but what was left out is actually conventional media, traditional media, and the role of journalism in reporting what is happening in Ukraine about the war. This is a really difficult question. This is what is the role of journalists actually in covering and making sure that what we read is really reliable and countering propaganda and disinformation. And today we have like a really good lineup of the presenters for this roundtable. We have Dr. Marta Dyczok. Marta Dyczok is an associate professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Western University. We have Dr. Viktoriia Romaniuk. Dr. Viktoriia Romaniuk is the director of Mohyla School of Journalism at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla. We have James Gatica Matheson, I hope I pronounced it correct. He is Chilean journalist based in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and over the past decades, James has worked as a foreign correspondent, reporting for global news for Chile's TVN, Ex Ante, ADN Radio, and Channel 13. We have Adam Zivo with us also. Adam is investigative journalist best known for his weekly columns in the National Post. He relocated to Ukraine at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion and has since written over 100 articles about the war. One of his articles was nominated for 2023 National Newspaper Award. And Adam also just recently testified in the parliament about the issue of Russian propaganda. And we also have Justin Ling, also investigative journalist, and Justin was also a part of that investigation that was conducted by the parliament. So, and I'm opening the discussion with a general question: what is the role of journalism in covering the war?
Journalism is in an existential crisis right now. We like to pretend like that's not true. It is true, right? We have lost trust with our audiences. We've lost audiences. We've lost financing. We've lost our ability to cover foreign affairs. We've lost our ability to tell people how the world actually is. And we've lost that ground to, in some cases, Russia, in some cases, disinformation agents here at home, in some cases, populist politicians, right? Like, we are in a really, really tough spot right now. At the beginning of the war, we had a renewed sense of purpose in a way that I don't think we've actually had in the media in quite some time. This was an international crisis, and media became the lens through which we understood this war and through which we figured out what a sort of unity of purpose looked like. And that was a really encouraging thing that lasted for all of 6 months. It's been really tough ever since to kind of get back to that and to try and still figure out how we fit into the conversation about this conflict. I don't think we're doing enough to figure out how to get back there, because the reality is, building on what was the conversation in the previous panel about narratives, journalists have abandoned the idea that we're narrative builders now. We have let others set narratives, and we just try to untangle them, and it's becoming unsustainable. And I think this is a really interesting challenge for us in the years to come. How do we get back to, in a factual, credible, objective way, building narratives that help people understand the world? Because if we're just trying to delineate between the Russian narrative, the Trump narrative, and those two things are increasingly similar these days, and then the Ukrainian narrative, we're not fundamentally giving people a coherent world. We're just trying to pull apart the arguments that other people are already making. And I think journalism has to take seriously, again, its agenda setting, a narrative setting role in society, and I think we've really abandoned that.
When it comes to the role of journalism in this conflict, I think it's important for us to understand that there are different kinds of journalists, and this is something I really want to impart upon the audience here today. So you can divide journalists working in Ukraine as two broad categories. So the first category would be staff journalists, so people who are on salary at the BBC, CBC, Globe and Mail, The Telegraph, These are the kind of people who, will stay in the Intercontinental Hotel, will have a budget for fixers, for insurance, for security, transit. They're very well resourced. And there were a lot of them at the very beginning of the war because that was the hot thing in the international news cycle, right? And then over time they disappeared because it cost a lot of money and you're going to allocate those resources to the next hot international conflict. Then in the second category, you have these freelancers who come in usually out of a sense of personal passion, moral obligation. I fall into this category. But for them, it's very hard to survive because making money in freelance journalism is almost impossible. To give you an example, some of the journalists who I've spoken with, these are people who are submitting to The Economist, to Foreign Affairs, to top-tier international publications, and they're getting only about, $500 per 900-word article or so, right? And you have to think about the amount of work that goes into an article like this. You're pitching to a number of different outlets. Oftentimes your pitches are rejected, and so you make no money off of that, but that's still sunk time. You have to go and do that reporting, and then in the end you get $500. So in a situation like this, you're not in it for the money, you're in it because you care, but continuing to do this kind of work can be very difficult. And there are still many freelancers who are working in Ukraine who are this vital pipeline of information, but slowly over time they're being whittled down. At this point, if you wanted a Canadian freelance journalist to come cover Ukraine, it would be financial suicide essentially because there's not that much demand for it. And so we have this problem here where the staff journalists have been reallocated elsewhere, and it's just not financially sustainable for the freelance journalists to do the work that they do often. Although it's much easier for European journalists to do this because it's much cheaper to take Ryanair than to spend, $1,400 flying from Toronto. Now, because of this, some of the journalists who work in Ukraine mix their journalism with activism, right? So you have journalist activists, and some of them are journalists who are also influencers. And sometimes they'll submit to traditional publications, but they also do a lot of work on YouTube, on Twitter, make that branding about themselves. And then that raises questions about what their role is in the information sphere because they often center themselves. Their journalistic standards aren't maybe as high as would be for other traditional journalists. But if you look at this complex ecosystem, you see that everyone has a slightly different role in this conflict with different benefits and different risks.
To be honest, it's really very difficult question, and I would systemize this aspect because the war in Ukraine in the context of transformation and journalism and media can be considered from several aspects. First of all is transformation and access to information and security issue. As a second, technology that changes the type of journalism and the way how we receive information and how we produce our materials. And the second, people and citizens, how to tell story about people and how to tell with people, how to talk about trauma and how to talk with traumatic experience. And of course, disinformation and propaganda. And each of these aspects, I believe this is really very interesting to consider and analyze because it's a really broad topic that we can discuss today.
From a non-North American or European point of view, in Latin America, this conflict came as just another conflict that it broke or rebroke in the world in February 2022. And I think our role as journalists and media was at the moment to explain the bigger picture, what actually were the implications, not just a conflict that was going on in Eastern Europe, but it had implications globally, and where were those for Latin America in particular. And the first reaction, as many large media organizations in the world, was to send crews to Ukraine, but it just for first few weeks. But then you have all this media exhaustment that people just watching the same footage one and after the other, that it looks quite similar, but you don't have like the capacity to actually have like a proper coverage on the ground, because obviously it's a quite far away conflict, but also you have to make it relevant for the people. And I think that is one of the challenges for the local journalists is to, for them first, understand where were those implications and why this conflict was important to be covered and explained extended vastly, but also then to explain it to the audiences. I think that was one of the challenges as professionals, because maybe most of them, they were not equipped with all the information.
Some of you might be wondering what I'm doing on this panel because I'm an academic and not a journalist. Well, I used to be a journalist. I used to report for The Guardian and CBC International in the early 1990s when I lived in Ukraine. I went there as an academic, but I worked as a journalist. It's interesting to hear some things have changed, some things have not changed. And the way you describe the media landscape, there are people who have staff jobs and, you know, they have budgets. And then people like me, and I guess you, were stringers. And you only get paid if you sell your story. You run around, you chase the story, and you may or may not get paid. So it's interesting to hear how little has changed in that sphere. What has changed, and this is putting on my analytical hat, is the role of journalism. We look at journalism and we look at social media, we look at political economy, and it's all merging. And there's something that I call media convergence that we're seeing. So it's no longer, this is legacy media, this is social media. We have a lot of examples of legacy media sending their message through social media. I mean, we heard about RIA Novosti going through Telegram, right? But we see that happening all the time. So I think the divisions between the types of media have blurred dramatically, and I think that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is the political economy of journalism, which is what our first speaker touched on. We're living in an era where money is not being made in journalism the way that it used to be. Who pays for a subscription of a newspaper anymore? Yay, okay. This is a wonderful audience. My students, when I ask them that question, maybe one hand goes up. We are used to receiving content for free, but it costs. There's a cost to producing that content, like paying a journalist and the platform and so on. So we're seeing that transformation, and that's where social media is winning, because to present information through social media, the cost is borne by the journalist, and the media outlet doesn't have to. So there's some continuity and there's some change, but I want to hear more from the journalists. So I'm not going to talk anymore, because I admire people who are working in Ukraine. I'm still occasionally doing some work for Hromadske Radio, plugging my favorite news media outlet from Ukraine. I'm going to be doing a report on this conference, by the way. But audiences, that's actually my last point. Where are people choosing to get information is mainly through social media platforms, right? So what you were saying about journalists becoming influencers, that's a fine line, right? Because journalism still has standards. And part of the reason getting your news story published sometimes is hard, because you have editors and you have, you know, the gatekeepers that prevent that fake news from being published for the most part. Whereas on social media, you just put anything you want and off it goes. Those are the issues that I think we want to be thinking about, but I want to hear more from the journalists. So.
Well, let me pick up on that a little bit, because I think it's easy to be panicked as well about the technological changes that are happening. Like, I'm panicked about many, many things, but I do tend to think that the technology and the shift towards kind of more social news is not an inherent bad. The bad is that we haven't figured out how to use it properly. We have been and I say we as people who still like good journalism, who, you know, believe in Ukraine's sovereignty, we have been quite bad at adopting these fora, right? So, you know, let's look at the last US presidential election. Like, what were the formats and the platforms and the shows which altered the election? They were influencers, they were podcasts, they were YouTube streams. There were groups like the Nelk Boys, which is a bunch of 20-something YouTubers out of Mississauga who got to sit down with the president, and who are probably one of the most watched and listened to shows available online right now. We have not figured out a comparator to that. We've not figured out a competitor to that, Joe Rogan is arguably one of the most trusted broadcasters in America, which is not good. How do you create not just a sort of shadow Joe Rogan, but how do you figure out how to talk to people on those formats? And I think this is like one of the most existential questions we have facing ourselves right now, because there's nothing inherently bad about why people are going to those shows and those platforms. What are those shows actually offering? Long form content with deep, often policy-oriented conversations about critical issues facing the world. Now, are those conversations rife with misinformation and complete nonsense conspiracy theories and total junk science? Yes. But the impulse to go seek that out is good. The impulse of doing your own research leads you to some bad places, but the impulse itself is good, right? Even the sort of investigative ethos that underpins a lot of conspiratorial thinking, it does come from a good place. It comes from wanting to challenge power. It comes from wanting to get to the real heart of the issue. It comes from a lot of the trappings that make good journalism. But what are we feeding those people? We're not competing for those eyeballs at all. Right? Traditional journalism continues to be this sort of voice of God approach. It continues to be short form. It continues to be just trust us, we have the evidence. And people are really radicalizing against it. Figuring out how you compete, as opposed to just telling people to stop engaging with bad content, has to be the path forward. And that's true for whether it's U.S. presidential politics, whether it's Ukraine or whatever. I'll just wrap up by saying some places I think are figuring this out or are doing well at it. You look like, I'll plug my favorite media outlet happening right now in Ukraine. You look at someone like Tim Mack, who runs the Counteroffensive, and he runs it on Substack. He's actually Canadian. He's a former national security reporter in D.C., moved to Ukraine shortly before the war, started the counteroffensive, hired a bunch of local staff, does fantastic reporting, really kind of trustworthy deep dives that try and reach people where they're at, and I think it's having some real successes at it. I think we can take cues from outlets like that.
I absolutely agree with my previous colleague because I received a question on the previous panel about artificial intelligence and new technology, and the answer was the same. Yes, of course, we have new technology and new instrument, but just instrument and just technology. So for me, it's very important to understand how journalism is changing in context of standards, ethical principles, the approach, how we talk with people in crisis during the war. I'm professor at university, Hiller School of Journalism. Among my graduates are WordPress photo winner and spokesperson of Ukrainian armed forces. For me, it's really great challenges. So how to prepare the curriculum, because I understand that my student and future journalism, after 2 years, I don't know, will work on the front line as a journalist, as a soldier. I don't know what I can do now with my curriculum, with my program. That is a great question. How journalism changing in conceptual, aspect. This is the main question, not technology, because technology, yes, of course, it's very important, newspaper or TV and now social media platform, but it's just instrument, it's just a tools. For us, very important to think about the role of journalism now, the role of ethical standards. Is it still conceptual or there are some changes? And what type of these changes we have?
I want to build upon what Justin said about the voice that we use as journalists. And I think that there is a problem when journalists only use this sort of hyper-objective voice of God approach to reporting things. Because the fact is that our audiences are aware of the fact that we are human beings and we have a certain, subjective bias. And when we pretend that that isn't the case and reporting on highly contentious issues, that can sometimes, but not always, breed mistrust. And I think that a solution here is that in some cases, we should embrace our own subjectivity and insert ourselves into these stories, not overly so because it's not about us, but enough so that we can be honest with our audiences, that we are just people who are experiencing this and we want you to see the war through our eyes to a certain extent. And I'm going to use an example of where I thought this was done really well in a different topic. We all remember the trucker protest, and that was all like very contentious. Around that time, a journalist by the name of Matt Gurney, who writes for The Line, which is a very popular Substack, did a series of dispatches where he wrote, these long, in-depth, slightly diaristic accounts of what it was like to be at this protest. And, he acknowledged the complexity of it. The way that he wrote about it was quite humble, right? He wasn't coming in as some hyper-objective voice that had fully understood what was happening and was seeing things from the sky. You read it and it's like, okay, this is a guy who walked here and went and saw this and had this impression, and you felt like you were seeing it through his eyes, and it felt more trustworthy. When I first started reporting on the war of Ukraine, I adopted some elements of that, tried to insert myself in the story a little bit, and heard from some of my readers that this made it more relatable and a bit more trustworthy. So ironically, by dropping the pretense of objectivity, we can sometimes build more trust with our readers.
I would like to take 2 points that were mentioned from our colleagues here in the panel. One about the platforms that are available, the new platforms, and also the idea of bringing the human touch to our work. And I think it comes maybe easier for younger generations of professionals. And I want to use the example that how I applied it and how I approach it. When I visit Ukraine last summer, had the idea to do a film for a TV station in Chile. I knew sort of the tour that we were going to do across former occupied cities in Kyiv Oblast, Irpin, Bucha, etc. We were able to speak with some people, survivors, etc. So I think the idea of trying to speak in different languages and in different platforms is not only traditional media, it's not only print, TV, and radio, but also now we have all these social media that are completely different formats as well. What I did was to create a small chronicles, like a daily diary, to post on my Instagram, like a short videos with a more personal touch, which I will never use in a written piece, of course. And it was nothing compared with a 15-minute film that I did for national TV, where I explained why it's a genocidal war and what the NGOs working on documenting war crimes in Ukraine's efforts are doing to bring Putin to the International Court of Justice. I mean, it's completely different audiences and messages, but I think the challenge is to trying to learn these languages and to adapt the message. I know that is challenging for colleagues who have been working in the industry for 20, 30 years, and maybe there's a 20-someone just graduate journalist who comes here with a TikTok that he will create in 5 minutes. And I think the element of ethical work and transparency and 100% like trustworthy reporting, and it's a challenge. But I think if we're not teaching that at journalism schools as well as the traditional media, I think the schools are also failing in preparing those professionals for the future. At the moment, I think we are adapting, but the next generation of journalists, they have to be well equipped with those skills as well.
You just brought that voice of the God. It is illusion that journalists, they have actually that voice of the God, and just because of the media that we have, and particularly because many reporters, not reporters, but those people who are speaking about Ukraine, they self-describe themselves as reporters, as journalists, and they have bigger actually outreach than journalists. How actually we need to address this issue?
There's an interesting thing here where we sort of ascribe success to certain influencers and kind of online first journalists and sort of less traditional journalists. We ascribe their success to them basically not playing by the rules or not being as professional as the rest of us. And in some cases that's true. But oftentimes a big part of their success is that they understand more acutely what audiences want more than the legacy players, right? It's like, what makes an influencer an influencer? That people are influenced by you, right? That you actually have impact, you have success, that people are going to you for whatever reason. And part of the reality of our modern era is that influencers have more currency oftentimes than legacy brands. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but there's an incredible study that happened a few years ago. It was like 2019 or so before the COVID pandemic. This university trying to measure the kind of relative impact and effect of health advice coming from various outlets. And they measured, the Associated Press, they measured, healthline.com, they measured Gwyneth Paltrow from Goop. Kind of unsurprisingly, they found that the Associated Press and Gwyneth Paltrow had comparative levels of trust for health advice. Now, that's bad to begin with, but the worst part is that if you put them head to head and they had conflicting advice, people were more likely to side with Gwyneth Paltrow over the Associated Press. The Associated Press is a massive institution of thousands of journalists, editors, fact checkers, and everything else. Gwyneth Paltrow is a woman who has some very bad ideas about health. But that, I think, tells you how much people are investing in personal individuals and brands these days. And I think we can learn a lot from what makes those people successful. And understanding what audiences want and trying to meet them where they're at is really, really important. This is why Russia finances organizations, allegedly, like Tenant Media, right? Because they recognize that the influencers who were represented by Tenant Media were commanding a massive amount of influence over their audiences, more so than the Associated Press or the New York Times or whatever. So the more I think that we can kind of play that game as well, but do it ethically, do it transparency, do it in the name of truth and journalism and fact, I think we stand to have a tremendous amount of impact. So I don't think we should shy away, and I think we all kind of agree on this, I don't think we should shy away from the prospect of being a little more influencer-y or finding new platforms and recognizing that also responding to what viewers and readers want is a really critical, important part of this, because part of being the voice of God is that you don't have to listen to your subjects, right?
To build up on that, I think part of the reason why people trust individuals more so than they trust large news institutions is that these news institutions are black boxes, right? So you read a health article produced by the Associated Press, you don't really know who wrote it, you don't really know what the editing process is like, right? It all feels very impersonal, it just kind of plopped out of the sky. Versus if you build a relationship with someone like Gwyneth Paltrow, I mean, she's wrong, but you have a sense of how she came up with these ideas, right? There's a sense of trust there in the individual, even if what they're saying is wrong, right? We practice this in our everyday lives, right? Sometimes we take some really bad advice from people who we know in our everyday lives and trust and care about. Just because there's that personal connection, we have a sense of the process behind the development of that advice. Now, when it comes to embracing a more influencer model of reporting, I think that's a good idea, and I agree with Justin there, but I think it also raises some questions about how that would work practically for news organizations. Because if none of your reporters are influencers, then that makes it really easy for you as a media organization to fire them or hire new people, right? Because everyone's kind of interchangeable. But if your reporter is positioned as an influencer and then they end up building a really loyal audience, that can create some problems, right? What happens now if that reporter stops listening to their editors so much because they know that they have some negotiating power? What happens if you fire that reporter and they go somewhere else and they've taken a large swath of their audience there too? I think it's a good idea. I can understand why, for example, some media organizations would be resistant to it at the higher level because it would erode their control over their employees.
I'm listening with fascination here. One of the people that I spoke to in Kyiv, Denis Bihus, investigative journalist, he said something that I've been thinking about ever since. He said human nature doesn't really fundamentally change. We're talking about issues of what is a journalist, what is the role of a journalist, journalism during war, influencers, new technology. It seems to me that the issues are the same, right? There's a lot of noise happening around these issues, but the three of you just nailed it, right? Like what you're trying to do is find out what's going on and share it with an audience. The format is perhaps changing, but to your point about values and principles, that's not changing. That's why we're talking about disinformation, because that's untrue, and that is something that nobody in this room is interested in. So I think the discussion really has to be about how the fundamental principles get translated in the current environment, because they haven't really changed, and I don't believe that they will change. But why is it that the influencers have the audiences? That's the question that fascinates me. Because why is Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin getting 20 million views? That's not because 20 million people are more interested in what he has to say than what other people have to say. There's a lot of political economy happening behind the scenes. People who own these platforms, people who promote these platforms and amplify these platforms. And why is it that his video is being shown way more often than somebody else's video? These are the questions we want to be thinking about, not so much about should we remain principled, but how is that information being manipulated and by whom? That's what journalists are struggling with, right? Because what you have to say, the three of you on stage here, is way more interesting than what Tucker Carlson had to say with Putin. And yet, you're not getting 12 million views, right? So why is that? I think that's where the question that journalists should be asking is what's going on with these technologies and media moguls that they're manipulating, how information is collected and disseminated, and audiences, again, on your Twitter feed, how much choice do you have what pops up first, second, third? Somebody's playing with your algorithm, right? Somebody is manipulating the way information is being circulated. So that's not the role of journalism, but journalists you guys have to think about this part.
Let me briefly say, stop using Twitter. Like, my God, stop. Like, genuinely, really stop. It is a weaponized platform. Like I said earlier, the only saving grace of Twitter over the last year has been community notes, which have given people an avenue to not just correct misinformation narratives, but to actually kind of do a sort of crowdsourced bit of fact-checking and journalism and to highlight good journalism. And Elon Musk is saying he's going to kill it because it's too pro-Ukrainian. So I think that tells you everything you have to know about that platform. It is a facilitator of not just mis and disinformation conspiracy theories, but it's contributing to the toxification of the entire information ecosystem, and it deserves to be abandoned with prejudice.
Me abandoning it isn't going to, like...
Well, it does. Every ad you see is financing the platform, and every user that logs on per month is justifying the further investment from the banks and from those who trust him.
I strongly disagree with you. I mean, the fact that Twitter is a cesspool of Russian propaganda is exactly why we should be on there. And I understand that the rules are stacked against us, but the people who need to understand what Ukraine is actually like are on Twitter. You know, those are the people that need more accurate information. If people like us just go to Blue Sky, and I know that's where you are, no shade, well, maybe partial shade, you're in an echo chamber. What's the point of sharing all of this, Ukrainian reporting in a network where people are already on side? We have to think about how to engage people who disagree with us, even if we might find them obnoxious, even if the rules are stacked against us. And we have to figure out strategically, how do we appeal to the things that matter to them so that we can convince them of the justice of our cause and the accuracy of our message.
I think that's like going on VK and saying, oh, well, the people I need to convince are on VK. It doesn't work because Twitter is a weaponized platform. The finger's on the scale. It's not an open and fair exchange. It is an echo chamber. It's an echo chamber not by function, but by design. And I think that's what makes it a tool for bad actors.
Not about democratic environment from international information environment. It's absolutely the special pro-government system, and we have to understand it. And it's just a few stage, and it's very interesting how this system will develop.
Yeah, it seems like we discussed this issue of censorship. It is actually something like a democratic also tool, or it's just only a tool of authoritarian regimes. So can democracy use censorship to prevent also the spread of disinformation and propaganda?
Let's talk about regulation rather than censorship.
Yeah.
And the reason Musk hates the EU, one of the many reasons, is because they're trying to regulate his platform. Whether they can effectively do it, we'll see. But they're the only ones that are trying to force him to play by the rules, and he doesn't like that. So there's a power struggle, but this is interesting because do you engage with disinformation, or do you go somewhere else and talk to people who already share your views? This is a difficult conversation to be having. How else do you try to address an audience that has a very different view from yours? I'm the one that's saying it's all being manipulated. But still, if you leave the game, you give up, right? So I think we should stay. Roman had that statistic up. I can't see him in the audience. That, if you counter a point, that also has an influence, right? I don't have answers. I have questions.
Yeah, no, again, I think leaving the conversation is not the solution. And on regulations about how to contra, to fight propaganda, just bringing a comment from this morning about Russian Today's Spanish version and influence in Latin America. I mentioned that it's been banned in several countries. Is that it was the best option to ban it? I don't know. Last October, we learned that Russia Today, Latin American or Spanish version director, went all the way from Moscow to Argentina to sign an agreement with a local university to work closely with a journalism school, just to bring to the table a new approach different from the Americanized or Westernized, etc. Was it the best idea to actually ban RT for your from your television? I don't think so. Or maybe it was somehow. They're still in social media, as I said earlier, and doing well. Now we have it in journalism schools as well. So maybe the approach should be different there.
What kind of approach then we actually have? Because I remember when the full-scale invasion started, Ukraine was considering actually relaunching contact in Ukraine, just because some Ukrainians were convinced that this is how we can reach to Russians and convince them. Then actually it is the way how we can stop the war. So probably it's the same argument. So
I actually wanted to build upon what we said earlier about engaging with people who are different from us. And I think that applies not just to audiences, but also to our colleagues as well. And we should be thinking about how can we engage with moderately pro-Russian journalists to convince them of the fact that they're misunderstanding, the conflict in Ukraine. I think it'd be a good idea for, Canadian Ukrainian civil society to actively reach out to some of these more fringe publications because they do have influence. Reach out to Rebel Media, reach out to True North Center, reach out to the Western Standard, reach out to publications that are a bit more on the right or, a bit more on the left, try talking to, Read the Maple as well, and try to slowly foster a relationship while also understanding that, there are many, many disagreements and this is not going to be a comfortable process. Because over time, if you can slowly open up people's eyes to the realities on the ground, then that's better than nothing, right?
There's sort of two things that are worth highlighting here. I mean, one is that information is not as powerful as we think it is. And by that I mean, we have, I think for many years, and I was certainly guilty of this as well, I think there was many people who deal in misinformation and disinformation research, and those who have worked on fact-checking and debunking and pre-bunking, all these other things. I think we all thought that misinformation kind of was an inherently toxic and affecting thing unto itself. The more we research this, the more we look at the long tail of our sort of current misinformation crisis, the more we're learning that it's not quite that simple. If it were that simple, a fact check or a pre-bunk or a debunk would really solve the problem, wouldn't it? But it hasn't. What we've actually seen is a really complex interplay between real information, false information, and a lot of stuff in between, right? Yes, countering is great. It's wonderful when someone puts on something online and then someone goes in the comments and says, that's totally wrong, here's proof that it's wrong. But what happens when someone counters the counter, right? That's what Twitter is now, right? Part of Twitter's algorithm is promoting the false information and the counter to the mainstream narrative. That's part of Twitter's purpose right now in Elon Musk's America, right? So information is creating an ecosystem. It's not individual pieces of information. It's an entire worldview, ethos, and ideology that we're now dealing with. That's a much more difficult thing to solve for, but the fundamental part of this is motivated reasoning. It's not just that somebody was touched by a piece of misinformation and were infected. There's a reason why they wanted to believe the thing they believe. People who are critical of big pharma are more likely to become anti-vaxxers, right? Because anti-vaccine narratives like to speak to the motivations behind being critical of big pharma. People who consider themselves anti-war and pro-peace are often susceptible to pro-Russian narratives because Russia loves to talk about peace, ironically, as it's the great aggressor in this war. But that works. And frankly, we do a bad job of playing in that space, and we do a bad job of using those motivations to speak to people as well. We keep thinking that if we just use enough facts and fact check enough people, things will change. But I think we're seeing it's just not working the way it should.
But if there's a conflict between different sources that are saying different things, and one is correct and one is incorrect, I mean, people are ultimately going to trust the source that they have a stronger personal relationship with. Not always, but generally. And this is why I think it's important to build some kind of personal relationship with influential voices that we disagree with, so that when they do come across disinformation, we can reach out to them and say, hey, maybe that's inaccurate, and we disagree on many different things, but you know me as a person, you have a sense of where I'm coming from, can you please trust me here that maybe this is not true. I mean, look, I'm a conservative writer, I write for the National Post. Through my work, I've interacted with people who are more to the right than I am, who are anti-Ukrainian, and through bonding with them over some of my other reporting, I've been able to, get my foot in the door and slowly open their eyes to more accurate understandings of Ukraine, and it works.
James, I would like to actually hear your perspective on this, because in Latin America, and as you describe, that we have also some presence of Russian narratives, and how do you actually work with those narratives to provide something like information on those narratives, and how to educate people also?
Yeah, I think things are way more polarized in the South, and the Canadian approach, I don't know if it will be the best. But also I think really what it helps is when we have our political leaders, presidents, MPs, or whatever, very verbal when it comes to who they're supporting, and that really reflects in public opinion polls and what the media are showing on their channels. I think that is key. If we have countries like Venezuela, they have strong links with oil and Russia, and you have the Venezuelan version of RT in which is called Telesur, which is just propaganda. Obviously, all that will resonate easily with the local population. Meanwhile, in countries like Argentina or Chile, that both presidents have been very strongly supporting Ukrainian people from the beginning, we see that people have a better understanding of these issues, and it's harder to find probably these people more left-wing oriented, having these thoughts about supporting Russia as we were in the Soviet Union times, because they keep having these lenses and having this idea of black and white, as we discussed earlier this morning. So I think the dialogue is harder to have in certain countries, but those public platforms like in mainstream media and also those who are in a position of power really reflects and helps the public opinion in Latin America.
I want to take this in a different direction. So we have 3 journalists here who have experience in Ukraine. This is quite unusual because we're academics. I'd like to hear from each of you what motivates you. You've chosen to go to Ukraine. What stories have you found the most challenging to cover? And in dealing with your media outlet, what have been your experiences? Is it hard to place your material? Do you get any pushback? Do they say, we want more? What motivates you? What's hard? What's your experience? If you don't mind sharing.
My biggest challenge with the editors was, okay, what you have shown me is what we have receiving via news agencies from the last 2.5 years. So it's more of the same. But I explain, no, but I was there. I was speaking directly with the people. Like, it's completely different. We came to realize that I have to explain. We're actually the first, I was the first Chilean journalist going to Ukraine in 2.5 years. There were a few going just, as I mentioned before, at the beginning, the first week or 2 before they have to leave. But no one actually went to Ukraine in 2.5 years. I also had the chance to speak with former Chilean soldier who is volunteering in Ukraine, who got severely injured. His perspective, he's speaking in Chilean and Spanish, also helped me to connect those both realities in quite far away contexts. And that was one of the issues. And also for me, the idea of bringing something new to the table was to conceptualize and trying to explain why this is a genocidal war, what NGOs are doing when documenting war crimes. And it's not just about blaming Putin or Russia about X bombing of X city in X residential building, but what these NGOs are doing is creating cases, identifying military units, and connecting those dots through the victims, and then creating a legal case to bring to the ICC, for example. I think those concrete facts really helps people to understand the bigger picture, and it's not just an ongoing conflict like they have seen on TV every single night from other conflicts like in Gaza and Israel or in Syria for the last decade or so. So I think they really resonate and what make it useful for the audiences in Chile when we show this in national television, and then we use it as well in different talks with universities and open the discussion as well, because to have someone who was there, it's a privilege for me to be able to have the trip and bring this experience back to Latin America, because it's completely different to speak it in the same language. It's just to translate realities and also to translate it to your own language. I think that is the challenge and what really resonates with the people.
So before the war in Ukraine, I was working as a technical writer at the Toronto Board of Trade. It wasn't my cup of tea. I didn't find it that meaningful. And I was also writing for the National Post on top of all of that. So I remember when the war started, I thought to myself, I want to do what I can. I felt this moral compulsion to help. But I realized there was only so much one could do from Toronto. So I had some vacation days, and I basically took a week off and flew over to Poland and, reported from there. And then went and spent one day in Lviv. And I remember feeling that this just felt right. It's like I felt alive. I felt like I had a purpose. I didn't like the idea of just, working 9 to 5, writing reports that no one would ever read and maybe getting wasted in Mexico like once a year. So then I quit my job, reduced my income by 60, 70%, disappeared to Ukraine, spent 2 months. And I thought, well, these stories need to be told. And that was the initial motivation. And then I ended up meeting someone in Odessa, falling in love. This person's now my fiance. We got engaged 2 weeks ago. And I found Ukraine as a country so beautiful and charming. I love Ukrainian culture. I love Ukrainian people. And I relocated to Ukraine because of that passion for the country and for this love of this individual. And now I'm tethered to it.
My story's less romantic. It's too bad. I do think Ukraine's a beautiful country, but I keep going in the winter, which also does make it difficult. But no, listen, I started going to Ukraine in 2018. Many of the reasons I care about the conflict are, I think, the same reasons why people end up siding with Russia, which is I am anti-war, and I am anti-colonialist, and I am anti-imperial. And that kind of leads me to the position of, this is one of the great struggles against kind of modern imperialism in this country. The fact that I watch people wind up on the exact opposite end of that, I think, is fascinating and has always sort of drawn me to the conflict, going back to the beginning of the invasion in 2014. But in terms of dealing with editors, I think I've been extremely lucky in that there is fatigue out there, and there is skepticism out there, and there is sort of provincialism out there that leads some journalists and editors and outlets to just not care. But I've never really had that experience. When I decided I was going, every editor I talked to would say, don't tell us you're going. Tell us when you get back so that our lawyers don't get angry at us if you end up getting hurt. Which I understand, and that's fine. I was at the time writing for the Globe and Mail before I defected to the Toronto Star. And the Globe and Mail said, yeah, listen, we have as much space in the paper as you want. Tell us what's going on. My editor at Wired, basically, I sent him an email saying, I'm going to be filing you 6 5,000-word stories about the state of military tech in Ukraine, and you're going to publish them. And he said, okay. My editor of foreign policy took features from me as well, and I now run my own kind of outlet on Substack. And everyone was like unbelievably supportive of it. When I talk to journalists who want to go do this sort of thing, my line is always like, if you can find the story, if you can find the new and you can find something interesting, people will want to publish it. There's an unlimited number of stories to tell over there, and everyone is so unbelievably accommodating. No one can plan a meeting more than 3 days in advance, but that's just very Ukrainian, I understand.
There's a bunch of students in the audience here. Go talk to him if you want to be a journalist, because this is an inspirational speech. You're probably thinking, what should I do with my life? This is like, journalism is a great thing to do, whether you do it for a year or your whole life. Talk to these people, because this is a lifestyle that I've experienced. You should try it. It's a way to see the world and really have an impact. have you guys had trouble placing your stories? Because the most difficult and challenging story that you've encountered in your Ukraine reporting. I'd like to hear that.
So everyone is familiar with what happened in Busha, but when I visited last June, I think it's St. Andrew's Church, if someone can correct me, where they found all the bodies. Now they have like a nice park and have a memorial and everything. I think it was very shocking to go back to the archive when they found the bodies and do this contrast on my film, just to put in pictures what actually was like in April 22, and so put together these pieces. So I was walking through this from the grounds of this church where the bodies were found. We have the memorial, we have all the names, I have the testimonies of those who survived. But then when I was editing the video, it just clicked to my head, like put the two things together. I have these bags full of bodies in places where I have nice streets now. That's also really clicked to the people who watch it. I think I wanted to share that in terms of how I experience it, because it's incredible what. Well, I also interview a photojournalist from the New York Times that got the first pictures from the bodies in the street as well. It was horrible what he first saw, and I include this in the film. And my editor wanted to blur everything. I said, but you cannot see anything. The idea is to show what actually happened. I think that Busha really was something horrible, because it was probably a city name that we never heard before, April 2022, at least in the south. But now you see it, and I immediately think about those bodies.
I actually think one of the most difficult stories, I'll say frustrating stories, was one I wrote in 2018. It was sort of a piece about Russian disinformation efforts. As part of that story, and I've kind of subsequently told it more expansively in some other forums, but part of that story I recounted my own experience building a relationship with the press attaché for the Russian embassy here in Ottawa. Press attaché is really code for intelligence operative, because that's what he was, and he has since been expelled from the country and declared PNG.
Because of you.
No, I helped. Not directly, but I think, there was a little, And the reality is, I penned this thing to some degree to say, this guy, his name was Kirill Kalinin, this guy was building relationships with me, and I disclosed it, with other journalists who didn't disclose it, and with other journalists who accepted stories from him. You can prove pretty conclusively that he was the source for several stories in some outlets credible and some outlets less credible. Maybe I was naive at the time, where I kind of published this and thought, well, that'll put an end to that. And it didn't. For example, I highlighted the fact that it was Kalinin who first started chopping the story that Chrystia Freeland's grandfather is this, odious Nazi, and all of this. And the story appears basically verbatim in a variety of outlets, basically 2 weeks after he first shops the story to me. And I thought to myself, well, showing this would clearly prove to people, hey, listen, here you can't get more direct than the Russian embassy proposing a story and then those exact details showing up in a blog, in a newspaper, and elsewhere. You can't get more direct proof of Russian meddling than that. But to this day, the number of people who still look at that story and go, well, it's all true. Oh, you think everything's Russia. You think everything's Russian meddling. It's like, no, I met him. We had beers. He tried to shop me on the story. So it's a frustrating thing to try and convince people that there are kind of malign forces at play. People tend to think that they are so clever and they are so smart they would never, ever be duped. But the reality is, we're rarely as clever as we think we are.
And this is actually about the standards, because you disclosed you were one of those, and for me that article was really brave at that moment. That is why I invited you for the conference, for my first conference, to speak also about that issue of propaganda, because you were one of those journalists who were really brave and spoke about this. But also, Adam, you also covered Russian propaganda in many of your articles, and this is also one of the ways how we are addressing this issue, being really honest about what we encounter, what we see, and how we report and how we frame it.
I feel very frustrated as a journalist reporting on things that I've seen with my own eyes, and having people simply not believe me, right? And I understand that many Ukrainians here share that frustration. You say civilian homes are being shelled and targeted by missiles, and people say, no, that's not true. For example, my mom, she's somewhat pro-Russian because she's Serbian. And I'll say, Odessans want to be part of Ukraine. And she'll be like, no, that's not true. And it's like, but I'm here. My fiance is an Odessan. I spend like so much time here. Anyways, it's really, really frustrating. And I think when I was younger, I had this belief that the force of the truth was enough, but that's not the case. And I understand that it's a naive view to take, and it's a very difficult one to let go of. But that's just simply the way it is. Now, in terms of a particular story, the hardest story I ever had to report on was also from Bucha. I arrived in Kyiv 2 weeks after it was liberated. Well, everyone retreated around there. And I followed some volunteer group that was specifically cleaning up schools and kindergartens. And, I had no experience in war reporting up until this point. Like, I spent 2 weeks in Lviv, but Lviv is Lviv. I remember arriving at this kindergarten, and it was horrifying to see it. It was horrifying to see children's books and toys, some of which were damaged with shrapnel, and like the wall behind it is entirely scarred with bullets and shrapnel. And that image was horrible. Seeing the kids' chairs with their names on it just stacked up in one side of the room. And I remember one particular thing that really shocked me. I went to the second floor, and there was a classroom there. The children hung up from one side of the room like little paper butterflies on pieces of string. And you could see on the ground that they were cutting them out by hand. They had managed to do half the room, and the other half was not done yet. And all of the paper butterflies were just discarded on the ground and all the string there. And I had this image, there were these children who, went to school and were cutting out paper butterflies to decorate their classroom. And then the next day there's war, and they have to flee with their parents to some strange land and become exiles, essentially. And I remember when I saw that, I felt this rage I'd never felt before. And it constricted my throat. I wanted to shout, but I couldn't say anything. And it was like this violent indignation. And I wish at that point that I could, take one of these soldiers who had done this and slam him down on the ground and say, why did you do this? Why? For what? And the frustrating thing here is as a journalist, no matter how good of a writer that you are, I hope I'm a good writer, there's a limit to what the written language can convey. And when you see horrible images like this firsthand, it's depressing to know that you'll never be able to fully convey that experience to your readers back home, especially if you only have a 1,200 word limit.
On forum, we interviewed one of also very well-known journalist, Evgenia Podobna, about 1 year ago. I like her phrase when she compared journalists who are actually Ukrainian journalists and foreign journalists. And for many foreign journalists, the war, what is happening in Ukraine, it's not their war. But what you are now describing, that it seems like it's also your war, that you can actually feel those emotions, and you can convey those emotions to the audience outside Ukraine, to the international audience. And this is really also crucial, that you can feel what people in Ukraine feel, because this is about narratives. It's not only about facts. And this is actually why I want to bring back.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we also always discuss about who we are, citizens or journalists, and sometimes it's really very difficult. Our teams, we have some guidelines, and one of the point is get rid of an emotion. Yeah, but it's really very difficult sometimes, because when we try to verify some news, some emotional news, sometimes it's unbelievable. No, it's impossible. But we have to verify, we have to prepare some special list and call some people and prepare materials, and we have to be objective. But it's really, really very, very difficult sometimes, because as I mentioned on the previous panel, some of my colleagues in the front line. And also I have my colleague who has husband on the front line. It's always very difficult, because there are a lot of personal story. Sometimes we are working without electricity, for example, without heat, energy. And some it's very, very difficult to communicate with my colleague who prepares some materials at night. And special reality, but we don't have another way. This is only one way for us, because it's not just a job or professional. It's a part of our international informational, maybe war, and this is our mission.
I think this is also a really good opportunity for us to collect some questions from the audience. Yeah.
I'm a recent graduate. I'm not a student anymore. I graduated from the University of Alberta, and I recently got accepted into a writing program, and I published an op-ed in Real Clear World titled "Trump Can and Should Save Ukraine." And I wanted to talk directly to Mr. Zivo, because you were talking about how to change the minds of people who don't believe you or don't even want to listen. I tried tailoring the op-ed to the American perspective of those who don't. It seems like they don't care at all. And now that Trump is being so much more America first, how do you connect to that audience, right? If you're pro-peace, like Mr. Ling was saying, you get targeted by the Russian narrative because they're doing that on purpose, because it's so easy to say, like, okay, we're going to stop the war. The question is, how do you respond to the counter of that is, why do you want to prolong the war? Like, let's not stop the war. How do you say we want to prolong the war?
That's easy. That's super easy. What you say is, Trump, tell Putin to stop the war. Tell Putin to withdraw his troops and end the war. Because that's the narrative that's missing. It's like Zelensky and Ukraine make peace. It's Putin that needs to make the peace, and that narrative needs to shift. That's my narrative, and I don't know if anybody else wants to join that, but you have to shift the narrative to where you believe it is. You don't respond to their narrative. Why don't Ukrainians want peace? That's nonsense. Ukrainians do want peace, but Putin is the one that can make the peace. That Putin is the one that has to stop killing. It's not Zelensky that will make the peace. If Trump wants to force somebody, that's the person to force, the person who's waging the war, not the person who's on the receiving end of the war. That's my view. I don't know what you guys think.
Alana Supran, some people in the room might know Alana, just wrote a thing on Facebook. She actually sent it to me when I was sitting in the audience earlier. Just a little thing, sharing a piece from this guy named Brian Medford, who's based in Kiev, wrote it a couple years ago about the allure of peacemongers. Basically, the argument that both of them are making is that, peacemongers as opposed to peacemakers kind of sell peace as the absence of conflict, not actual peace, right? And that sounds a little airy-fairy, but there's this long piece where he kind of very much makes the argument that part of the appeal of the Putin's narrative and the Trump agenda is that they're going to force the end of this conflict, and they're going to, basically kind of design this wonderful end to the war, but they're not actually proposing peace. They're not actually proposing security. They're not actually proposing long-term stability. It is an easy, cheap, baseless narrative that easily falls apart at the slightest poke. But why does it work? It works because it never gets poked. It works because it's a narrative that doesn't have to be challenged. It works because Donald Trump in particular and Vladimir Putin many, many years ago have both built information ecosystems that do not allow in competing viewpoints. Russia has obviously done this on a level of internet filtering and criminalizing dissent. Donald Trump is just starting to build that apparatus. But this really kind of underlines the importance of building both channels and platforms and shows and publications that invite people in to help give them at least give them the counter narrative, help build them a world of countervailing viewpoints and competing versions of the world, one that is actually robust and heterodox and interesting. And that's going to require kind of making platforms and shows and all these other things that people want to engage in. And that's going to be a lot of work. And it's going to require building things. We need to stop relying on CNN and Twitter and everything else to get this message across, because it hasn't been enough thus far. So it's not an easy thing to do here, but creating a space where we can actually tell people, listen, we need to make peace, not force it, right? We need to actually figure out what international security looks like again. We need to enjoy the benefits of the international security arrangement we built in the 20th century, and Donald Trump does not do that for you.
To the earlier question about how do we talk to people who are America first and anti-Ukraine. So there's two ways to think about this. So first of all, making an intellectual appeal to why supporting Ukraine is putting America first. So emphasizing how supporting Ukraine actually bolsters the United States' interests, talking about how the amount of money that the United States has sent to Ukraine is only 5% of their annual defense budget, how most of it is actually reinvested back into American manufacturing, which produces jobs for everyday Americans just like you, right? Blue collar, red-blooded Americans, not some, bikes, like the latte sipping, bike riding, coastal elites, whatever. You gotta use that kind of imagery and framing. Talk about how American weapons can be tested in Ukraine in a way that they can't really be tested, in a peaceful environment, and how that makes the United States stronger, right? Talk about how Ukraine is making these leaps and bounds in drone warfare and finding ways to produce drones that are really cheap and really effective. And partnering with Ukraine will turbocharge the United States' drone warfare capabilities, which will be really important for a conflict with China in the future. So that's the intellectual side. And then some of them will say, well, what about a proxy war? Oh, you're using Ukraine as a proxy war. And it's like, no, the Ukrainians want to do this. The Ukrainians want to put America first too, because they want Ukraine and America to be first together. Talk about how, for example, if Ukraine wins the war, suddenly you have a strong pro-American Ukraine to influence European politics. What does that mean for the United States' influence in Europe? And then on top of that, you can work in communities or other populations that they feel connected to, right? And this is going to be very specific to the different kinds of audiences that you're talking to. So for example, if you're writing for a conservative reader who, cares a lot about Israel and cares a lot about anti-Semitism, well, invoke the Jewish Ukrainian community. Talk about how Chabad Odessa, will tell you all about how you can be proud and Jewish in Ukraine, and that's totally okay. Talk about how Jewish conservatives have a responsibility to save Ukraine's Jews from missiles and rockets, and that we should expect an alliance there. There's all sorts of different ways to make this work. The options are somewhat limitless if you just think it through.
Thank you so much. The follow-up is, do you ever worry that that type of spin is viewed as West-splaining?
For Ukrainians here, do you guys feel like this is West-splaining, or is it useful?
I think it is incredibly useful. I wrote here, Putin is the ultimate influencer. We're trying to combat somebody who has influenced and gotten to the emotions of people who don't know those intellectual arguments. So they are susceptible so easily to the slight twinges that Putin makes to history. And they recognize, I know World War II, I know whatever the other main historical aspects are. So they hear that, and then they don't quite realize that what they're listening to is misinformation.
Well, so they don't know. That's a problem. That's why we need journalists like you to write op-eds explaining why this is the case,
Okay.
and ideally seeking out conservative-leaning publications to get it to the audiences that need to read this kind of content.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay.
You talked about the sort of need to include a subjectivity in reporting. I feel like that's not a particularly new idea. It's been around since, new journalism, sort of Hunter S. Thompson. And then additionally, you've said that, journalism in a crisis is dying out, it's disappearing. That's been the case for like 10 years, basically. These arguments have existed for a very long time. If journalism has been in a crisis for a very long time and legacy media hasn't adapted, is it maybe not time to just give up on that model and try to go fully influencer? Or do you think that legacy media that's aligned with Ukraine can actually adapt and become like RIA News and be active on Telegram?
Yeah. Let me answer that backwards, because I actually am fascinated by Telegram. It is a bad app founded by a bad man that is clearly co-opted by Russian intelligence. But it has been a source for an unbelievable expansion of audiences for pro-Ukrainian and Ukrainian media outlets and individuals. It has become an unbelievable source of real-time information, images and video, not always for good, but nevertheless an incredible source. But more importantly, it helps build dedicated audiences. Part of the problem of our current crisis it's not just that we're lacking money, and it's not just that we've lost trust. It's that we've surrendered our distribution model for news. It used to be that we used to throw a bundled up thing of dead trees at your doorstep, and then you would open it up, and even if you only wanted the crossword, you found yourself leafing through a whole bunch of news about the state of the world, and you wound up better educated because of it. That was the sort of deal we made in society, is that if you wanted to get to the classifieds, you had to flip through the news of the day. We've totally lost that. We've unbundled the newspaper, and we've completely surrendered the distribution model to companies like Meta and Twitter, who don't give a shit about news and who don't give a shit about educating all of us about the state of the world. And that has come with unbelievable consequences for our media literacy, for our investment in the world, for our humanity, and even caring about the plight of people who are facing bombardment every single day. That has, I mean, it's been happening for a long time. It's been 10 years. It's been 10 years of decline, and I'm not sure we're at rock bottom yet, which is a depressing thing to think about. Now, listen, there are outlets that have been in the process of trying to reinvent themselves for many years. Some of them are being successful. The New York Times is trying to go back to that old model of financing its journalism through Wordle. Is it working? Yes. That's a half-hearted endorsement I appreciate, but we have to figure out, again, how to get people engaged in the news, engaged in the world, and interested. But again, I started the whole thing by telling you that people are eager and hungry for this stuff, right? People are sitting down and listening to 3-hour interviews on Joe Rogan because they think it's the news. How do we get them to listen to the actual news for 3 hours? Because apparently they want to. They're eager for long-form content about the state of the world, and we're largely not supplying it to them. Can legacy media figure out how to do a 3-hour news show? Can the New York Times, rather than just delivering the headlines via the Daily, can the New York Times deliver a long-form, in-depth conversation about the world with Ann Applebaum that actually helps people appreciate what's going on instead of going to Rogan for all this content? I think there is still this optimism as well that, you know, let me put it this way. I think Adam is right. All of the narratives that Adam is selling are very convincing and they're very good. But if you're playing it at the exact same volume of somebody making equally compelling arguments from the other side, do you win out? Right? This is part of the problem. I agree with all of those things. They convinced me. But if somebody is already ensconced in a narrative that it is a proxy war, that people are homeless on the streets because all this money is going to Ukraine, that NATO expansion was inherently provocative, turning up all of those narratives and blasting it at that person isn't guaranteed to work by any stretch. What we need to figure out is, how do you get someone living in a usable news and information ecosystem as opposed to trying to drown out the toxic one they currently swim in? And that's a really difficult thing. And if anyone tells you they have an easy answer, I don't think any of us are, but if anyone tells you they have an easy answer to this, they have no idea what they're talking about.
Traditional media will remain as it is to some extent, maybe like in a briefer way. But also, I think the challenge for everyone is to be more creative. And I'm thinking about the New York Times Daily, the podcast, like how many people listen to that on a daily basis, and how popular it became, and how they click it when it comes to reshape the information that they're being published on paper for decades, if not centuries now, in a podcast format on a daily basis. I mean, it's incredibly attractive for people who are eager to be informed and to consume information, but it's just in a different format. I think we need to be open to adapt, to find new ways, to test some of those. Some of those may work, others maybe not. I was reading an article on the Reuters Institute of Journalism about TikTok. They explained that most media outlets use TikTok for topics of sports, celebrities, and entertainment, but they're not publishing content on politics or economics or the serious issues, quote unquote, on TikTok. And the amount of people who are spending time on TikTok is huge, and we're missing an opportunity over there. We need to learn how to speak in TikTok.
As a retired editor, I have to know this. How much editing is done to your reporting from Ukraine?
For my Substack, not enough. Hence why they're all very long and occasionally written with typos. I read for a lot of different publications. I think every single editor I work with is in the business of making the writing more readable and more interesting. and I really have no complaints. Like I really think, if anything, I have editors who are goading me into being kind of more direct and more explanatory about the situation, not less. I'm sure there are outlets that are different, but everywhere I work is mission aligned, let's say.
The National Post has always been amazing. They've never asked me to change anything substantive. The main tension is that I keep on wanting to write more, and they keep on saying, Adam, you have to keep it at 900 words, maybe 1,200 at the most. So there's been some tension there, and I kind of annoyed my editors at the very beginning of the war, but eventually we worked it all out. The only time I've ever had my work substantive, I've gotten substantial pushback. An editor was actually from a very progressive publication called Extra Magazine. They're Canada's largest LGBTQ publication, and I write about the LGBTQ community because I'm gay, and I wrote about the queer community in Ukraine. And I was doing a project for Pride Toronto, and they asked me to look into queer Black refugees in Ukraine. There were maybe 5 of them in the country. I found 2. I made it work somehow, and I interviewed them in Lviv. And I wrote this really long piece about them. It was 4,000 words. And I asked them about, what is it like to be a Nigerian gay refugee in Ukraine? And it was actually really interesting. They told me all about, the student population in Kharkiv and how they came to Ukraine and came to love the country. And around this time, there was that big narrative about Ukraine being super, super racist. And I asked them, well, do you feel like there's a huge racism problem in Ukraine? And they both said, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, sure. When they arrived in the early 2010s, they said yes. But they said, as of now, not really. My one friend, I'm not going to name him, he mentioned how some skinhead pulled a knife on him 15 years ago. But more recently, some drunk guy, shouted a slur at him, and some anti-racist babushka came out and was like, leave him alone. So I wrote this piece, and I wrote it accurately. And then Extra Magazine, the editor I was working with, said, well, how dare you imply that Ukraine is not racist? Well, and I was like, well, that's what they said. And I asked them, do you feel like there's a big Nazi problem in Ukraine? They said, no, that's ridiculous. The editor kept on pushing and pushing and pushing for me to remove any mention of Ukraine not being racist, but he was really happy to ensure, he really wanted me to put in about Ukraine being racist. To a point where I was at a draft where only 10 to 15% of the total words talked about racism and how it wasn't racist. And he said, well, why are you obsessed with mentioning that Ukraine's not racist? And I was like, well, it's only 10 to 15%, so I feel like someone here is not interpreting this accurately. It got to the point where I actually had to retract the article, and I said, you are asking me to make changes to the point where you're asking me to misrepresent these interviewees, and I don't think that's ethical. And I ended up having to put it into a much smaller queer publication, which I thought was really disappointing. Ultimately, the article went viral on Twitter because it was so random. I mean, who else is going to write something about this? But in the end, because this hyper-progressive, far-left, editor didn't believe that, Ukraine could be progressive, because they had negative stereotypes about Ukraine and Eastern Europe as being, regressive, very backwards. Many people didn't end up seeing that content, which is unfortunate.
With my film, when I presented the script before editing, I had this funny interaction with my editor. He said, we need more Russian voices. I was like, we have all these big stories. Yes, but whatever you include is nonsense. I mean, trying to find what Lavrov says about Busha, we just include it because it brings you contrast. It's balance at the end of the day. I remember a conversation with a reporter in Kyiv who works for a larger newspaper in the state. He had this big fight with the editor because he said, yes, I've been doing all this massive reporting, talking with survivors, whatever. Why do you have to spend half of the article giving space for the Kremlin spokesperson when just wasting line in the space in the article? At the end of the day, it's balance and trying to avoid to point it out as bias. In Latin America, we have this saying that you cannot, in journalism, you cannot be the widow, mooring all those victims all the time and just talking about this topic for years and years. You have to show both sides of the pictures, although one is actually nonsense.
Everyone who's married knows there is no such thing as objective facts or objective truth. Bit of advice, Adam, okay? So after the 4-year glow, everything is subjective. Why am I saying this? Because there is a resonance of that in journalism and in academia. and that is that there's always a tension between being detached with facts or believing that you are detached with facts versus narrative. If you haven't read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Nexus, please do. It talks about the fundamentals of narrative and how that has replicated itself in social media and journalism. So the question is this: as journalists and as academics, you will be struggling with that tension between I am detached, I report on facts, and I have seen the horrors in Ukraine, and I need to get my story out. I need to challenge the negative narratives, the false narratives that are out there. How do you negotiate that very difficult balance and tension?
I mean, listen, like, all journalism is narrative. Occasionally there's an AP or Reuters story that is just a collection of facts with no particular focus, but that's pretty rare, and frankly, that's not what most of journalism is. Journalism is, by definition, when you construct a lead, you are weaving a narrative. And that's the first sentence in a story. When you write the nut graph, which tells the reader what the point of the story is and where it's going to go and what you're going to tell them, that's weaving a narrative. Journalism at its very core has to be narrative building, because you are trying not to just tell them what happened, but why what happened matters and in what context it happened. For example, I'll tell this really, really briefly, but since it first kind of bubbled up, I've been obsessed with the disinformation about the biolabs that have been in Ukraine. And if you're not familiar, Ukraine has been apparently building coronaviruses to be released. So COVID 2026 is going to be from Ukraine. The original model was China. This one's going to be Ukraine. This narrative bubbled up. I mean, this narrative was being shopped by Russia for many, many years. And it was then kind of picked up by QAnon and then repurposed by Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. and all of this. And it is a fascinating story because, here's a case of naked Russian propaganda. Like, the people who helped popularize the story were explicit that they got it from Russia. It was picked up and then kind of woven into a broader narrative about the origins of COVID-19 and the dangers of Anthony Fauci's bioweapons program and all this other stuff. That is a masterful tale of narrative building. But when it came time to report on it, we didn't actually try to tell a real broad narrative of it, right? A lot of the coverage of it said, oh, this is Russian propaganda, don't listen to it, and then we kind of moved on. But that story became a guiding light for a huge number of people, including people who are now running the US government. And they used that narrative to get into office. They're using that narrative to dismantle the US public health system, and they're using that narrative to remove and restrict funding for Ukraine. That is an extraordinary arc for this story. And to some degree, offering the counter to it means telling a better narrative. And it's actually a fascinating story as to why the US government funds biological research in Ukraine that goes back to the Soviet bioweapons program. And I won't get into the whole thing. I just wrote a whole thing on this, so hence why I'm thinking about it. But to some degree, our insistence that we don't construct narratives, we're just journalists. All we do is sort of paint the world as it is. We don't have stories to tell, I think has surrendered a big part of our responsibility in countering those narratives and offering a vision of the world that is more complicated and that kind of trusts our readers' intelligence to follow along what is a complicated story.
I would like to combine the answer for your question and also discussion about the peace narrative. So I think the peace narrative is a huge manipulation because everyone wants peace. I really want peace, and you, and you, and you, everyone over the world, yeah? But what peace means for everyone, it's could be absolutely different category. For me, for Russian, for American citizen. For journalism, it's very important to provide some information based on the fact, international law, and some international document and factual information without emotion, without something that gives us opportunity to interpret this term. It's very important, and also it's very important to provide information based on the human dignity, because it's peace, it's about human life, it's about country, history, and war. It's really very interesting example, because sometimes, yes, to provide factual information It's really very important, but also we teach our students to tell the story. Storytelling. I remember how many articles we read about how to tell story and how to create story, emotional and very interesting. So what is the balance here? Yeah, it's very important. For me, it's very important to be responsible for the result, for the materials that we provided, especially when we talk about the huge audience. So factual information based on international law, ethical principles. But of course, we have to think about our audience and tell the story with the dignity as a journalist.
As mentioned earlier, I think that we should embrace our subjectivity as journalists, to kind of go back to a new journalism style that was popular a few decades ago, and just to trust the reader to give the reader the option to decide whether or not they should trust you, right? So instead of pretending to be, totally detached from the story, instead of pretending to be, the voice of God, just tell your reader, like, here I am, this is my perspective, this is how I'm related to the story, this is how I'm going to write. And knowing that, you can make of my articles what you will. And I think that level of transparency shows a certain level of respect for your reader as well. Kind of puts you on a level playing field. And I think that is a decent approach. I also understand that is not an approach that is, commonly accepted within the world of journalism. But I think it could be a niche approach that could be effective.
Just listening to the discussion about traditional journalism being in existential crisis, maybe think about broader dynamics that we are observing with this anti-establishment sentiment spreading in North America, in the EU, the anti-establishment vote, and that kind of like brought some politicians into power, including in Ukraine and in the United States, lack of trust, international institutions, like there is this increasing perception that we live in a post-justice society with trust towards the UN and other international institutions in international law declining. So I'm just wondering whether we need to perhaps broaden this discussion a little bit. How does the crisis in traditional journalism, in your opinion, connects to these broader dynamics that we are observing? And do you think we can really address the challenges of traditional journalism without really addressing these broader dynamics created by neo-capitalism and the increasing economic inequality?
I think you're absolutely right. This is part of a larger series of issues. This isn't specific to journalism. To put a positive spin on it, we have been in crises in the past. This is a really difficult set of challenges we're facing. I'm old enough to remember that the prediction was newspapers are going to die, books are going to die. And here we are. There are books, there are newspapers, they're not dead. They're transforming. They're facing a lot of different challenges. But what I find really encouraging is legacy media is not dead, and it's not really dying. I think it is transforming. I think you're right with the challenges. I keep seeing media convergence. I mean, when we see Donald Trump speaking, he's not exclusively using social media. He is still giving press conferences that are then retweeted or posted on various other social media networks. So we're seeing media convergence. That's part of, as you pointed out, the larger socioeconomic challenges facing the planet. But I think the solutions are out there. I don't have them, but maybe somebody else does.
Actually, I do have a proposed solution for Ukraine specifically that could also perhaps be scaled up to other issues as well. And I think that media organizations have to think more. They should explore nonprofit funding for some forms of journalism that cannot be paid for under normal market dynamics. If we want to use a case study, there's the Investigative Journalism Fund, which is a Canadian nonprofit that raises money from family foundations. I think they've got like maybe $1 million a year, something crazy like that. And then they hire journalists and then partner with media organizations and use that to produce journalism that otherwise could not be paid for. On my end, I have a small nonprofit that focuses on drugs and crime. I raised money for a fellowship, and now I employ a full-time journalist who works on the drugs and crime file in partnership with the media outlets. Going back to what I said at the very beginning of this whole panel, there's an issue here where a lot of Ukraine reporting is just not being done because people can't afford to do it, right? Because the staff journalists have moved on to the next thing, and the freelance journalists just cannot afford to make this work. For example, recently I spoke with a journalist who is very well known in Ukraine and in the West, who has broken some very important stories, and they live in an apartment that doesn't have heating, right? Because they can barely afford to survive. I know another English journalist who's written for some very big outlets, and they're basically living off of their savings. So I think this is where the diaspora and just generally, Ukrainian, Canadian civil society actors or other civil society actors who are interested in this conflict and in journalism in general should try fundraising to fund fellowships for freelance journalists to go to Ukraine so we can fill that gap. And it shouldn't cost that much money. You have to cover insurance and all that stuff, but I think it's a fairly feasible solution. And if you make it a condition of these fellowships that there should be no paywalls on any of the content produced, and that partnering organizations should focus on syndicating their content to as many different publications as possible, I think it could be a very efficient solution to the information gaps currently plaguing this topic.
Picking up on two things. One is the mention of the new journalism, the Hunter S. Thompson era of media. At various points throughout the history of modern journalism in the West, when things have properly become, people have become disillusioned with media, when people have lost faith in media, it's when media stops being independent, critical, adversarial in some cases. Hunter S. Thompson came at a time of kind of extraordinary deference to power. The early 2000s, Glenn Greenwald, he came up at a time when the New York Times had been responsible for leading America into a truly disastrous series of wars, right? Part of the reason people have lost faith in us, and part of the reason Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump and everybody else are able to point the finger at us and say they can't be trusted, is to some degree because we've become defenders of the status quo and defenders of institutions. And I get why, because institutions are under assault, and institutions are what separates us from the animals to some degree. But nevertheless, we do have to figure out how we can recalibrate ourselves to be challengers of the status quo again, but challengers in a way that it is ambitious about rebuilding those institutions and making them better, right? Rather than just defending Joe Biden for doing maintenance of defense of Ukraine. How about challenging Joe Biden more aggressively as a guy who could not actually get behind the idea of a Ukrainian victory, right? I think there is an open invitation for us to become more ambitious, more critical, and speaking truth to power, to use an old axiom. When people see you challenging people who have power, they're more likely to put a bit of faith in you because they have criticisms of people in power as well.
Okay, I think it is to bring conclusion our session. Thank you.